Thank you so much, Travis. We are going to keep rolling on with our agenda here. I'd like to introduce to you Journey Paulus. She is doing a presentation on the integration of renewable energy in post-mining land use. Journey?
Thanks, Bree. Just a small introduction to myself. I moved up to the Yukon 6 years ago, and I've done environmental consulting, and then I worked at a mine site in environment and permitting manager. So I have on-site experience with the Yukon process and the challenges that I think all mine sites really run into in terms of reclamation and closure planning, as well as the electricity problem in terms of power is one of the challenges that every single mine site has. I mean, as a Yukoner, I see it in my day-to-day life. In the winter, you know the power's going to go out. How are you going to keep your house warm? So these are the challenges that we all face. And I'm lucky that the Yukon government makes us constantly think about reclamation and closure planning. And as a result, I've had a chance to really, in detail, think about how can we do things differently. Now that I'm a consultant instead of working for a mining company that had a brownfield site, I think we really have a chance in the Yukon with so many developments that are just at the start of their process to do things entirely differently. And so that's what we want to talk about today. So in terms of background and some context, anyone who's taken a look at reclamation and closure planning in the Yukon knows that our documents are really quite out of date and aged. But really, when you think about things like what is the vision and what are our goals, these aren't going to fundamentally change over time. But what we have to think about is how are we going to get there, and what is our systems going to be in place that can enable some flexibility in terms of what are we going to find as a way of making things work for communities, the mine site, and looking at closure in a different way. So I'm fortunate this morning to go after a lot of great speakers who've already really talked about some of the challenges that we have today and some of the opportunities. You know, why are we talking about renewables now? It's about a price. You know, that when I started my career 25 years ago, you wouldn't have thought about renewables as an option on a mine site in terms of powering a site, period. Now it's economic, so now we can really look at it in a different way. So land use at the end of closure. I mean, obviously, traditional land uses aren't to put a renewable plant on, but in terms of land use for solar and wind energy, you know, the NIMBY movement's out there. I came up from Alberta, I was just down there. There's obviously a contrasting uses of land. And, you know, I grew up in southern Alberta where I'd go out to the fields. There are huge rows of wind turbines now, and there is a resistance, right? So can we find a way of taking an industrial site that's already in use and maybe making that suitable for power generation instead of taking new land and clearing it? So in terms of ideas, we're not talking about new ideas. The US is well ahead of us in talking about this a long time ago, 2011. You know, so it's about really changing how we make this a possibility. It's not that we can't do this, it's about how do we make it really work in practice. So there are a whole bunch of sites who are already working on renewables that are in the news. Obviously, Sunmine's one of the most famous ones that we have a solar facility on a reclaimed mine site. You know, look at what this is. I mean, really, to me, this is what success really could look like in terms of generating power for a local community in closure on a site where we can still do active reclamation in other areas, but there are always areas of a mine site where this maybe is a good use of an area. or where it's an area where we need some time. And so maybe it's a 10-year time frame where you can look at, hey, let's put some solar panels or some other renewable site on a location on your site where you can't yet get to reclamation in terms of, say, a forest, but you can have it be a state that it could be a power generation. Snowlines obviously received a reward in part for this work, but I think it's a great example of what I think we do need to be thinking about in terms of partnerships too. Their partnership with Notre Dame is exactly what, for especially closure, you want to be thinking about. In the Yukon, most of our sites are in First Nation territories where this could be an option for economic reconciliation too. You know, this is an option where 25 years ago, my mother was a lawyer who was working in Alberta where First Nation had significant royalties of gas, where one of the projects that they looked at was feeding an ATCO gas plant, and then in turn, the cost of heating in everybody's homes was driven down because the royalty went straight to the gas plant. Gas plant generated power, the power costs were reduced for the whole community. You know, so there's creative ideas out there that we can use by bringing us all together to talk about this and how can we do different. This was a fairly recent announcement in August this year that up at Diavit, they're again putting in huge power plants that have a real opportunity to change the way we're doing business and change the economic potential for mine sites too in the closure phase. Everybody knows closure is a cost, a significant cost. If we can reduce some of it, that's an awesome opportunity too. So obviously the type of power is going to have to be on a site-specific basis. My experience is in permitting solar panels and wind energy, but that's not the only options. I mean, we just heard a conversation today about nuclear. Maybe that's an option too on a site, but energy storage has to be part of the solution in the Yukon. Everybody knows it. You know, the last presentation put up some nice fancy diagrams on what everyone already knows, that the answer is you need a lot more power in the winter when it's freezing cold up here. So generation that includes storage, I think has to be part of the solution too. There's some really creative pumped hydro answers in the US has more of these, but there's starting to be one in Tent Mountain in BC. So that's an option too. In some sites, this may be suitable where you had a pit lake, say, at the top and an ability to run it downstream to generate power. So again, you know, these are all techniques that we already have out there, but it's about planning in a different way. The last one that I wanted to talk about was biofuels, in that Osanko, in combination with Casino and Selkirk Development Corp, is looking at this for waste generation side, but you know, there's no reason that you can't be really creative with this side. You know, this is the side that in some ways I'm most excited about the future on, in that I think we've just started. You know, the crop side in terms of covers, I mean, awesome potential. I mean, there's so much out there that we don't know and that we could do differently in terms of closure. And then obviously mine reclamation, you know, has so much potential to combine with people like universities. I mean, I've had the opportunity, I mean, Taylor's sitting there. I don't see Ben right now in the crowd, but you know, at Minto, we worked with 2 different students on reclamation. And Taylor, well, I'm sure she'll be talking about it this afternoon. Oh, there you are, Ben. Thank you. Taylor looked at the use of invasive species for her work. You know, those are the things that we can do differently and have so much potential that we haven't even thought about. So this is the area where I think we have done the least work, but it has the most potential to really change the way we do things entirely. So now comes the trouble of how to do things differently in terms of Yukon's process. Everybody knows it's a challenge to get through the Yukon's regulatory process. And if you were to add the power generation side, it adds another complexity. But it has the potential to, in some ways, be synergistic. And having permitted both mines and power plants, you know, in many ways they have the same base process. So I don't think it dramatically changes, but it's something where you have to get that engagement early now, though, if you want to be starting to think about, hey, once we have a suitable site, we'd like to, as part of our progressive reclamation, move to putting some power on our site. Well, that takes a conversation well in advance with a First Nation, in particular in the Yukon government, in terms of closure. You're moving it out further, and you have to figure out in our process, how is it going to work for things like security? How is it going to work for things like closure certificates if you're going to put a power plant on a site, right? These are the things that we're going to have to think through and try and find a way through to make them really happen in practice. So obviously, I've been talking about the closure side, but I really see it as the power generation side is something that we could be thinking about throughout the whole process. We all know power is going to be a problem on a mine site, and it's a cost of doing business, but it's also an opportunity to start thinking about things differently. You know, we had questions asked of Travis in terms of modularity. Well, I think that we can think about power in renewable side is also a modular approach. That, okay, we finished using a waste dump. Could we be putting enough power on site for, say, to run our mill? Not run our whole site, because probably we're not going to have enough space to do that. But could we inch it up over time until we were running a significant part of our mine site, and then during closure, be feeding the power back down a line into a community? So this is just a quick cycle photo that makes us start thinking about planning and closure and how are we going to make it work from the government side. You know, that's where I really see the challenges right now is how are you going to create a system? You know, we have a new mining legislation that we're all talking about. How is it going to enable something like this to actually happen and not be just a challenge where you have a mine site saying, okay, we want our closure certificate, and now the power site is being run by a third party. We're done. How are we going to make that happen? Well, our legislation and our governance has to start thinking about these things. And they have to start thinking about them now so that 10 years from now, when you actually want to put in place the power plant, you have some answers, because part of making the economics work are going to be sorting these problems out. You know, if I can't reduce my security, it's going to be a lot tougher if I have a huge amount of security tied up on the fact that all my waste dumps don't get a check mark because they're currently a power generation station. So we just did some rough modeling to just kind of get people thinking about what the cost could look like and how there's a benefit. Obviously, every mine site's going to have a slightly different diagram, but these are just to kind of give you an idea of the OPEX and the COPEX, the closure costs, and how there is a win here, you know, but we have to really start thinking about it differently to get the win. So all of us know diesel generation's where you currently get your power if you're not connected to a grid. We all also know that there's targets coming in place in the Yukon for mines. You know, this is going to drive a change. And so we have to start thinking about, though, how do we actually make the costs work for us? So renewables, the other aspect to really look at is obviously here we talked about that this was on a 25-year turbine is what one of the scenarios. We've run them for solar too, but the timelines, right? You have a 10-year mine life, 25-year turbine, so that's where you're getting some benefits, is the time difference. But then obviously you have to look at what's that power going back to? And so you have to be connected to a grid or connected to a community that can make use of the power going back during the post-mine phase. So in my mind, there's a lot of thinking that has to be done to change the way we're doing things and enable it in terms of governance so that we can actually make it happen in practice and make it doable as an option for companies to start putting in their environmental assessments with this as an option for closure and make it work. And then start talking to who are your partners during closure for this type of activity. And I think there's some great opportunities for economic reconciliation and significant jobs too for people to construct these projects during a time when maybe construction's going down and jobs at a mine site are going down. This is an option too for continued employment for a period of time. So obviously we also have to look at the pillars. I grabbed this one because I like it better in terms of nice diagrams from the BC process, but you know, it's the same in every single process. You know, how are these all connected and how are we making it work for communities? And in my case, in the Yukon, how are we making it work for Yukoners too? So I wanted to finish up a few minutes early and give people an opportunity for questions and hopefully get us a little closer to on track. Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Journey. So we did have a canceled talk today. That was Mark Patterson. He is stuck in Portugal. I don't know if I'm jealous of that or not, but he isn't able to make it here today. Although they did sponsor Geoscience, so we do thank Magnet for that sponsorship.